So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for tonight, Mr. Malcolm Turnbull.
Look, the big story, the big geopolitical story that we are experiencing at the moment is the rise of Asia, in particular the rise of China. It is an extraordinary phenomenon. We have never seen so much economic growth occur so quickly. Consider this. 30 years ago, China was barely open to the world at all. Since then, its economy has grown 18 times, an annual average of 10%. India's GDP, which used to jog along under what the Indians themselves called the anemic Hindu rate of growth, has also taken off. It's probably about a generation behind China in terms of economic growth overall. But its economy has grown in that period 6 times, an average annual rate of 6%. China is now the world's second largest economy. It will overtake the United States in 2016, according to the IMF, and at some time in the 2020s, its defence spending will overtake the United States in absolute terms. So there's a gigantic change in the nature and the centre of gravity of the world's economy. In 1990, which is not that long ago, probably seems like an eon ago to the students here, but to the older ones among us, it doesn't seem very long ago at all, North America and Europe produced about half of all global GDP. By 2030, their share will decline to a quarter. In contrast, emerging Asia, which is Asia excluding Japan, and that's because Japan, I should say, industrialised earlier than any of the other Asian nations. Emerging Asia produced only 14% of world GDP in 1990, but by 2030 its share is projected to triple to 44%. By then, a third of the world's output will come from China and India. Now, the pace and the scale of this shift is utterly unprecedented. There's never been a country as big as China that has grown so fast. But it's important to remember that from a Chinese or indeed an Indian perspective, this rapid growth in wealth and power is not so much a rise, we shouldn't really use that term, although we all do, but a return to the natural order of things. Because for most of the past 2,000 years, China and India, if we treat each as a single economic region, and of course India has only been an Indian nation since 1947, but China and India were the 2 largest economies in the world, accounting for about half of the world's economic output. So from antiquity until the middle of the 19th century. And of course then they became subject to, firstly, colonisation, conquest and extraordinary violence, particularly in the case of China, and went through a period of 150 years of very, very bitter humiliation. But their current climb up the GDP rankings restores them to where history or population, or both, predicts they should be. Now, however, changes in the relative economic position of large and powerful nations are seldom easy or trouble-free. Americans, in particular, are still struggling to come to grips with the rise of China in particular, which represents, in the minds of many Americans, a unique challenge to the United States. The post-GFC recession in the United States, where recovery has been sluggish at best, has made relative economic performance a hot issue. Americans are not coping well with the reality that China is growing faster and catching up fast in GDP terms. Now, of course, per capita incomes in China will remain much lower than those in the United States for a long time yet. But there is an anxiety that you see in the United States. The Americans have long had a very deep sense of their own exceptionalism. And in that sense, they've got quite a lot in common with China. And since birth, they've been assured that they will always be the strongest, richest and cleverest nation on earth. Now, however, they increasingly feel that the core of their economy is being hollowed out. Their pessimism does have a basis. 42,000 factories closed in the US between 2001 and 2010, 5.5 million manufacturing jobs gone. Tom Friedman, the New York Times columnist, in his latest book called That Used to Be Us, gives eloquent testimony to the growing sense of inadequacy Americans feel as they compare their country to China. Its title was inspired by a speech President Obama made in November 2010 where he said, and I quote, "It makes no sense for China to have better rail systems than us and Singapore having better airports than us. And we just learned that China now has the fastest supercomputer on earth. That used to be us." Now, of course, from a Chinese point of view, it makes perfect sense to have better rail systems than the Americans, most of their rail systems, of course, are in very poor repair. And from a Singaporean point of view, it makes perfect sense for them to have the best airport in the world, if that is in fact the case. So you can see there's a gigantic sense, a huge sense of inadequacy growing, particularly in the West, particularly in the United States, by reason of the success of China and other, of course, emerging Asian economies. And you see it here from our own point of view. I mean, consider this. In 1995, Shanghai opened the first part of its metro. It had a few stations and a few kilometres of track. It wasn't a very big deal to begin with, as you'd expect. It now has over 420 kilometres of track and carries well over 6 million people a day and hundreds of stations. And ask yourself this: how much mass transit was built? How many kilometres of subway, of urban rail was built throughout all of Australia since 1995? And I regret to tell you, it was, in this city, it wasn't even 20 kilometres worth. Pathetic contribution. So there is a sense everywhere in the West that we are falling behind. Now, at the same time as all of this is happening, this enormous change, a return to the natural order of things from a Chinese perspective, information technology and communications are making more sectors and jobs trade exposed. Many service jobs in the US and Australia, for example, are becoming globally contestable. Not just call centres, but financial and legal analysts, programmers, designers, architects. So everything is becoming more trade exposed. There used to be a time when economists would cite retail as a sector that was sort of almost the definitive non-trade exposed sector. And store owners used to compete with other retailers in the locality. Now, so if you think of a fashion shop, a dress shop in Oxford Street, the proprietor would have thought that she was competing with the other shops in the area, perhaps with a department store in David Jones, certainly with the shops up in Westfield at Bondi Junction. Now she is competing with the entire world. So the retail sector has become thoroughly trade exposed in many categories, not in all categories. Now, these trends of globalisation and technology are economic forces that are far bigger than any one country, even countries as large and powerful as China or the United States. Yet the shifts they are causing in economic power or the competitiveness of particular industries in the West, such as our car industry, are often crudely seen as the fault of exporters such as China and other East Asian nations. Advanced economies cannot blame China or the rest of emerging Asia for our own choices. If our roads and subways are not in good repair, that's our problem. If, as we learn today and with the Grattan Institute report, our standards of literacy and numeracy have fallen behind the comparable levels or the levels of comparable students and comparable schools in Shanghai and Hong Kong and Seoul, then we should be asking ourselves, why are we not doing better? It's not we shouldn't be resentful about being overtaken by other countries. The question is not why are we declining relative to China. The question is why aren't we not being as good as we can be. When Deng Xiaoping opened China to the world in 1979, he invoked the example of the 15th century admiral Zheng He, who had led great fleets across the Indian Ocean. In those days, an open and confident China was the world's strongest nation. When later emperors closed China to the rest of the world, Deng Xiaoping reminded the hardliners in 1979, China began a decline that ended with humiliating invasion, colonisation and exploitation by stronger nations, European powers and Japan in particular. So given that history, it's no surprise that when Mao Zedong announced his triumph from the top of Tiananmen in 1949, his first words were, the Chinese people have stood up. 中国人们站起来了. The Chinese people have stood up. He's saying we have the 150 years of humiliation has come to an end. Now, it's no surprise that as China becomes richer, it seeks to strengthen its military. But we need to be very careful in the West not to automatically assume, as I think some people in the United States do, that a stronger and more militarily capable China is going to be a militarily aggressive or expansionist one. China has settled many, not all, but many of its border disputes, and indeed has settled its border with Russia, which is remarkable, really, because there are large sections of the Russian Federation, the whole Amurskaya province, no less, and other territories, that were basically stolen from China via unequal treaties in the 1850s and 1860s. So in the same way that the British took the new territories from China and Hong Kong, and the Portuguese took Macau. So the Chinese could have held back settling that, left those unresolved issues as a casus belli for use at a future time when they were even stronger and Russia was even weaker, but they didn't. But Kissinger makes a very good point, which I think is worth remembering, and he is a pragmatist about foreign policy, famously. He points out that unlike the USSR or even the United States, China does not seek to persuade other countries to adopt its values, let alone its system of government. So this is not a Soviet Union that wants to export an ideology or a political system. The central role of trade in China's prosperity also argues for its rise to remain peaceful. In 2010, China's trade was 55% of its GDP, the same as for Britain in the 1870s, the pinnacle or the peak, I would guess, of the Pax Britannica. So given the importance of a stable economy in the Chinese regime's legitimacy, which of course is based on delivering economic growth. I mean, if you think of the Chinese polity, the bargain between the Communist Party and the people is no more than this. You let us run the country and we'll deliver continuing economic growth. If China's economic growth stalls, then the whole edifice of that regime is under enormous threat. Now, I don't think there's no likelihood of the Chinese, or prospect, I think, of the Chinese seeking to declare some Chinese version of the Monroe Doctrine. This was the doctrine that President James Monroe declared, US President James Monroe, of course, in 1823, when he said essentially that the Western Hemisphere was the American sphere of influence, and the Americans would regard as a threat to the United States any attempt by any European power to assert itself or reinstate its rule in any countries in North or South America that had become independent. Now, China is in a very different position. It is surrounded by very, very powerful countries, very powerful nations. India, Russia, Japan, Korea, and of course the United States in its projection into the Pacific. But we have to be clear-eyed about this. And while we would not expect, nor would anyone welcome, some sort of East Asian Monroe Doctrine. Nonetheless, we have to recognise that the era of the United States being the sole unchallenged superpower projecting in that region is coming to an end. Inevitably, there will be more of a balance of powers in the East Asian region. And it's important, very important, that all of us in the region, the big powers and the smaller powers and the medium powers, all of us remember that it is as these changes occur, it is mightily in our interest to be engaged with China and all of the other powers in the region, and to ensure that this transition is a peaceful one. Cool heads are required on all sides. China, of course, needs to be much more transparent about its goals in the region, and it needs to build confidence with its neighbours. It's important to bear in mind China has virtually no allies. Think about it. Surrounded by all these powerful countries, who are its allies? North Korea? Well, with allies like that, who needs enemies, you might say? It has a very good relationship with Pakistan, but again, that is really seen through the prism of the contest between Pakistan and India. But it has managed to create anxiety without a long history of overt aggression among all of its neighbours. So China has a confidence-building task ahead of us, but also we have a task of engagement. Now, I've talked for a little longer than I planned, so I'll just wrap up on this point. You're seeing, I think, with the broad sweep of history, something like a return to situation normal. But Australia is very, very well positioned in this area. There are many risks, but we need to be clear-eyed, pragmatic and practical in the way we analyse the opportunities and the risks as we hedge against contingencies, but above all, as we ensure that as this economic boom continues, we always have a mind on ensuring that at the end of it, we will have something tangible to show for it. Thank you very much.